Again, I'm Alicia Pharg from GTI, the Gas Technology Institute. GTI is a research, development, and training organization for the U.S. natural gas industry. We're focused exclusively on onshore natural gas infrastructure, exploration and production, and end-use applications. I can go ahead and just get started. Maybe we'll wait for the slides. So what I wanted to talk about today was some of the trends and some of the challenges that we're facing in the U.S. And I picked the ones that I thought would be relevant to the Israeli experience and where you guys are going with your natural gas. In the U.S., we have a number of things that we're going through that, although it might seem like the Israeli market and the U.S. market have very little in common, but as I was putting together this presentation, I saw a couple of things that popped out to me that were very similar and between Israel and the U.S., which I thought was unusual. In the U.S., we have recently come across our shale gas, and it has dramatically changed the outlook for the natural gas industry. As Travis had mentioned before, for a long time, our production was declining. And we were actually building LNG terminals to import natural gas. And after we found that shale gas, some of those terminals were stopped mid-construction and said, no, now we have enough natural gas that we want to export gas now instead of importing it. And so we're looking at an industry that's dramatically changing, and all sorts of new end-use applications are coming online. Things like distributed generation, microgrids, gas to liquids, and even the transportation sector. So very similar to what's going on in Israel now is going on in the U.S. because we have such an abundant, low-cost energy source. All right, so I wanted to describe a little bit about the onshore natural gas industry in the U.S. So we do have offshore exploration and production as well as onshore. The onshore has really been dominated by the hydraulic fracturing and the shale gas in the last 5 or so years. And like I just described, it's been a dramatic change in the outlook, the energy outlook of the U.S. So you've got your exploration and production, again, onshore and offshore. Gathering lines bring that gas to centralized production facilities that do the processing and the cleanup of the natural gas. Then that's put into high-pressure transmission pipelines that transport the natural gas all across the country. And then that brings the gas to a city gate station, which is where the local distribution company takes ownership of the gas, reduces the pressure, uses lower pressure pipelines, and distributes the gas to power producers, commercial and residential users. One of the things that's really changed recently is some of the supply patterns. It was pretty well established about 10 years ago where all the natural gas was coming from and where it's going. But now with all of the shale gas, the supply pattern has really changed, and we have all these smaller basins that have new natural gas, and it's put a little bit of a strain on our infrastructure because we don't have the capacity to bring it from the Midwest and the Northeast where a lot of this new supply is. So it has put some strain on our infrastructure. I put some numbers up here to just show you the extent of the pipeline infrastructure in the U.S. We've got about 30,000 kilometers of gathering lines. We have almost 500,000 kilometers of the high-pressure transmission pipe that transports the gas across the country. And then the distribution pipe, which is the lower pressure pipe that brings it to the house and to the commercial and residential facilities. We've got about 3.4 million kilometers with about 65 million services that actually bring the gas to the customer site. All right, so what's I had initially talked about one of the similarities that I saw between the U.S. and the Israeli markets, and that's with the supply and the new opportunities that that's providing for end users. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about today specifically was the impact that that's having on the training and the knowledge management needs in the energy industry, specifically the workforce challenges. For a number of different reasons, which I'll go into, we're facing a crisis really in the U.S. in terms of having the employees and the knowledge base and the skill set necessary to build up this infrastructure that's necessary and for all of these end-use applications that are now becoming viable. Part of the reason is just sheerly demographics. After World War II, we had a big influx of workers into the energy industry, and they were workers that made a career of it, and they spent 30, 40 years at a company, and that was great because they built up all of the skills and all of the training for a career in the energy industry. But as David had mentioned earlier, we really got a little too comfortable, and we weren't building up our knowledge base, and we weren't backfilling those workers. We relied on the people that started when they were 20 and planned on retiring when they were 65. And we didn't realize that eventually all of those people are going to retire. I mean, of course we realized it, but it, we didn't take the threat seriously enough. And now we're really facing the consequence of it. And a speaker earlier had that DNV study that was done that really showed that having access to trained workers is the top concern of a number of energy company CEOs. One of the silver linings to the economic downturn has been the fact that some of these workers that had wanted to retire can't retire because their savings were wiped out in 2008. So the benefactors of that are the energy industry that now get to keep their workers for another few years because the workers just aren't ready to retire yet for financial reasons. So hopefully we're taking advantage of this and using this as an opportunity to extract the knowledge out of those workers before they leave for good. So the primary problem with the aging workforce, aside from kind of physical limitations and productivity limitations, is really the knowledge transfer. There's decades of experience inside the heads of a lot of these workers, and when they leave, that knowledge walks right out the door with them. And sometimes it's documented, sometimes it's written into policies and procedures and knowledge management systems, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of things like troubleshooting skills and SME knowledge, they're just not well documented, and it's really a problem for this newer workforce that's coming in. They just don't have the experience of the older generations, and it's really a problem for transferring over from the older workers to the newer generation. So speaking of younger workers, this is the generation of people that's now coming into the workforce, and there's a lot of stereotypes associated with them. Probably some of them deserved, maybe others not as much. But stereotypes like they don't respect authority, and they're not as reliable, and they look at their job as just a job. They don't look at it as a career, and they don't have the same investment in acquiring these skills that the older generations had. Now, on the flip side of that, some of these younger workers, or most of these younger workers, do have some assets that the older generations don't have. And one that's specifically useful in terms of knowledge management and training is the fact that they're tech savvy, and they're willing to embrace new technologies. With things like smartphones and tablets and all of the social media, there's lots of opportunities to use those types of things to provide the knowledge transfer and the training that maybe the older generations weren't as comfortable using. So what I'm going to propose to you today is that we can use the aptitude of the younger generation for technology. We can use that as an asset in knowledge management and technology transfer. All right, so a handful of solutions that we've been working on in the U.S. First of all, a blended learning, and I'll talk more about what I specifically mean by that. The second thing is technology. Like I had just mentioned, technology, there's all sorts of opportunities for using technology to provide the knowledge management and the transfer. And then I'll talk about some industry-wide programs that we have in the U.S. that we have found very useful in disseminating information. All right, so first let's talk about blended learning. So this is a learning strategy that combines traditional classroom training with field training and online training. So the online component is what is new and what gives us this term blended learning. So obviously online training, there's a lot of benefits to it. It's very flexible, it can be lower cost. But one of the things that I think is really a real positive aspect is the fact that the younger workers, they almost expect it. Not only do they accept the fact that they can take training by sitting in front of a computer, but they really expect to have knowledge at their fingertips. They expect to be able to go online whenever they want, access whatever information they want. So I think it's our responsibility to make that information available to them in that way. On the opposite end of that, though, there are definitely limitations to online learning. One of the biggest ones is that it's not always as engaging. Even when you have people that are used to sitting in front of a computer and consuming large amounts of information, that's not always the best way to get certain types of information across. What we have found is that online training is good for basic skills, things that don't require a lot of interaction, just where you can teach the basic fundamentals of a certain industry. And for more complicated and more complex learning skills, the online method can be useful for refresher and information update trainings. So that's where this blended learning approach comes in. You figure out what the best teaching method is for different types of knowledge, and then you can put together a program that leverages the best of each of these types of learning environments. I mean, I personally, I got my MBA using a blended learning approach, and for topics I was interested in, the online learning worked fine. I was engaged, I watched the lectures online, I went to the chat rooms, I exchanged information. But for my accounting class, which I was not at all interested in, I found myself being very passive and just kind of going through the motions of the online engagement. So again, you have to match your program to the audience and to the content. So here's just some advantages of the blended learning. I think we talked about most of this already. Again, there's definitely a cost advantage as well as meeting some of the newer generations' learning expectations. So at GTI, training is an important part of our offering to the natural gas industry. We've been doing it for about 70 years. We've trained about 60,000 gas professionals in the U.S. as well as across the world, all the way from supply all the way to end use. And this whole blended learning approach has really become the backbone of our program. We still offer the traditional classroom and hands-on training, but we're seeing more and more companies investing in the online training as part of a blended learning program. So we've adapted our program to meet those expectations and those new emerging needs of the younger workforce. All right, so the other thing that I wanted to propose is that technology has a role to play in knowledge transfer and training and knowledge management. I don't want to jump on the new technology bandwagon just for the sake of it, but I do think that things like tablets and smartphones have improved the user experience of mobile devices so much that now it really has to be considered as part of an overall strategy for capturing information and disseminating it out to the new workforce. We've seen a big move for natural gas utility companies to put information either online or directly on a tablet device and to outfit a large percentage of the workforce with this information. Our regulations require operators to provide certain types of information to their utility workers, and they actually get fined if some of the training materials or the documentation, if they're out of date or if there's missing pages. If you go back through some of the biggest citations over the last 5 to 10 years, fines imposed by the federal regulator have been because the field workers did not have access to the most up-to-date information. So because of that, we've seen a lot of the utility companies, a lot of the pipeline operators move towards this tablet smartphone approach, because then you can just put it all online and then the users have access to it through their smartphone or their mobile devices. Another thing that we've seen more and more manufacturers doing is providing troubleshooting skills. So like YouTube videos, if there's a common problem that occurs with some certain type of equipment, they'll make a training video and put it on YouTube, and then the users can actually access that on their smartphones out in the fields. And then, of course, manuals and references and other types of training materials that a utility company or a pipeline operator might have. Putting that online makes the updating that much easier, and it really allows streamlined access to field workers out in the field right when they need it. Another thing that we've seen is what we call tailgate meetings, and that's like a meeting at the beginning of the day for a field crew or at the end of the day. And you know, they're just opportunities to share lessons learned or experiences that someone might have had, use it as a teaching opportunity for the other workers. And we've seen more and more companies using tablets and videos as a mechanism for these tailgate meetings, as a way to share information. Whereas before it was just a guy talking, now you actually have some sort of technology to support this knowledge transfer. So another technology component that's different than just information dissemination, I'll call it technology-based oversight. So providing information to the field workers is one thing, but you can also use technology to make sure that policies and procedures are followed. One of the things that we've been working on at GTI that's been very successful is this concept of remote quality monitoring. So we're looking at how we can use technology to monitor work that goes on in the field to make sure that it's done properly, make sure that it's done according to company procedures. I'll talk more about this tomorrow in my presentation, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples as to what I mean, you know, how technology can be used for this remote monitoring. In the U.S., we have leak survey regulations. So utility companies have to walk their pipeline once a year and leak survey it to make sure it's not leaking. And it's not uncommon for operators to receive fines and violation notices because they found that their workers took shortcuts or inadvertently didn't walk the route that they were supposed to, and they missed segments of the pipe. And you know, in the worst case scenario, that could result in an incident where there's some sort of explosion. And you know, sometimes when we go back and look at it, we see that this line was not actually surveyed when it should have been. So one option for using technology is to have GPS tracking to track the routes that the leak surveyors walk. So instead of relying on them to manually document their routes, now you have a digital record to show that they actually went where they were supposed to. And then the second example, it's painfully simple. It's a very simple concept, but we have found that it has a very powerful impact on the field workers. And that's the idea of having the field workers take pictures of critical steps throughout the new installation process. So whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing, whether it's installing a meter set or a pipe or doing some sort of welding procedures, we've identified critical steps in these operations, and then we have the contractors use their smartphones to just take a picture. They can take a picture of the welds, they can take a picture of the pressure gauge before and after the pressure test, so that you have some sort of documentation that things were done appropriately. I'll stop here because I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but those are just ways that technology can be used to make sure that what's done out in the field is done appropriately. All right, the next two things that I'm going to talk about are industry initiatives. The utility industry is unique in that it's not competitive in the traditional sense. You have local monopolies where you just have one utility provider, and that's good in an information sharing sense, because it allows utility companies to share information without the threat of losing some sort of competitive advantage. So the advocacy organization in the U.S. is called the American Gas Association. And they've put together a number of programs that have been very successful in providing training and knowledge and collecting it and disseminating it out to the entire industry. One of their programs is the Best Practices program. And what they do is for important operations and procedures, they identify companies that are what we call best performers. And they document what they do, what their program looks like, maybe even they get their policies and procedures, and then they share that out to the rest of the industry so that the industry has an opportunity to learn from these best performers. They also do benchmarking and roundtables and questionnaires and other forms of information sharing and networking among peers. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was these industry surveys. It's been a very effective mechanism for sharing information. So if an operator has a question about a certain type of device or a certain policy or a certain procedure, a certain way of doing things, they can submit this question to the American Gas Association's website, and on a monthly or a quarterly basis, they issue out this question, and it might be a question like, how deep do you bury pipe in a certain region? And then all the companies, usually 50 companies or so, respond to that. Sometimes it's just anecdotal narrative information. Other times companies will actually share their policies and procedures. And then AGA combines all of that information and then sends it out to the whole industry. So now you have this mechanism that is really efficient and effective at gathering information that is useful to the entire country and sharing it with the entire industry. So that's all I had. I just want to kind of reemphasize that what Israel is going through now with all of your new infrastructure and your new industries, it might not seem like the U.S. has much in common because we've been using gas for 100 years. We actually have pipe that's 100 years old now. But there's a lot of things that we are going through that are mirror what is going on in Israel just because of where we are. We're almost like starting over again. And we're building new infrastructure. We have the same workforce issues where we really have this like dumbbell demographics where you have your older experienced workers and then your younger newer workers that are just coming into the industry. So we're facing a lot of the same issues and look forward to continuing to work together with you.